Why mature empaths stop explaining themselves. There is something happening inside with people that almost no one talks about openly. And it is not a moment of giving up. It is not bitterness. It is not the slow hardening of someone who was once warm. What it is, in its truest form, is a psychological event so precise, so structurally inevitable, that once you understand it, you will never again mistake silence for defeat. There exists a threshold in the life of a mature empath, a point beyond which the constant labor of justifying their inner world to others simply ceases. Not because they have lost faith in connection, not because they no longer care what others think, but because something far deeper has shifted inside them, something that most people, even those close to them, will never fully comprehend. And here is the truth most people miss. The decision to stop explaining is not a decision at all. It is an arrival, the culmination of a long psychological process that has been quietly building beneath the surface of every conversation, every misunderstanding, every moment they tried to make someone else understand something that person was never equipped to receive. You must understand what it means to be wired the way a mature empath is wired. It is not simply a matter of feeling things more deeply than others, though that is certainly true. It is the particular exhaustion of possessing a form of perception that consistently outpaces the frameworks available to explain it. Imagine attempting to describe color to someone who has only ever known light and shadow. The words exist. The effort is genuine. But the architecture of understanding required to receive what you are saying simply does not yet exist in the listener. This is the quiet tragedy that lives at the center of every empath's relational history. They have spent years, sometimes decades, constructing elaborate explanations for what they sense, what they feel, why they respond the way they respond. And they have watched, with a particular kind of internal grief, as those explanations landed without resonance. As the person across from them nodded politely, or worse, reduced what had just been offered into something convenient, something dismissible, something that fit the shape of what they already believed. What begins to accumulate inside the empath is not resentment, though that may appear on the surface. What accumulates is data, pattern after pattern, stored not in conscious memory alone, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep unconscious architecture of the self. And slowly, below the threshold of awareness, a recognition begins to form. Not every mind is a suitable container for certain truths, and this recognition, once it crosses into conscious awareness, initiates something irreversible. The pattern recognition threshold, as we might call it, is not simply a moment of clarity. It is a structural recalibration of how the empath processes relational dynamics. Before this threshold is crossed, the empath operates on an implicit assumption, the assumption that sufficient effort, sufficient articulation, sufficient emotional labor will eventually produce understanding. They believe on some level that if they can just find the right words, the right angle of approach, the right moment of vulnerability, the other person will finally see what they are trying to show them. And so they keep trying. They rephrase. They simplify. They approach the same truth from a different direction. They offer context, nuance, history. They absorb the discomfort of being misread and return, again and again, to the task of making themselves legible to others. This is not weakness. This is not codependency, though it can manifest alongside it. It is something more specific. It is the survival strategy of a psyche that once learned that being understood was a matter of safety, that if others could truly comprehend your inner world, you would be less alone, less vulnerable, less exposed to the particular danger of being misidentified. But here is what most people don't realize about this strategy. It was never fully reciprocal. While the empath invested enormous energy in translating their inner experience into forms others could grasp, very few were undertaking the same labor in reverse. Very few were attempting to reach across the perceptual gap with the same dedication. And the empath, with their heightened sensitivity to relational dynamics, registered this asymmetry long before they consciously acknowledged it. It entered them as a low-grade sensation, a subtle awareness that certain conversations, no matter how carefully navigated, would always resolve in the same predictable pattern. The empath would extend. The other would receive partially, or not at all, and the gap between what was offered and what was understood would remain. Over time, this awareness sharpened. It moved from sensation to recognition, from recognition to knowledge. And this knowledge, once fully integrated, permanently altered the internal calculus of connection. This is where everything changes, because the moment the empath internalizes the pattern fully, the moment they understand it not just intellectually but structurally, in the deepest layers of their psychological architecture, the motivation to explain begins to dissolve. Not violently, not dramatically, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide that does not announce its own retreating. And what fills the space left behind is something that superficially resembles indifference, but is, in its actual nature, something profoundly different. It is discrimination, the capacity to perceive precisely who is and who is not capable of receiving a particular level of psychological truth. And once this capacity has been fully activated, the empath no longer offers their inner world indiscriminately. They begin, for perhaps the first time in their life, to treat their own perception as something valuable, something that does not require justification, something that does not need to earn the right to exist by being legible to others. You must understand the particular cruelty of what happens to empaths in the period before this threshold is reached, because it is not simply that they are misunderstood. Many people are misunderstood, and they adjust their expectations accordingly without undergoing the specific psychological transformation we are examining here. What happens to the empath is structurally different. It is rooted in the particular way their consciousness interfaces with the emotional and psychological realities of others. A mature empath does not simply feel what others feel. They perceive the architecture beneath what others feel. They sense the unacknowledged fear beneath someone's certainty. They register the suppressed grief beneath someone's irritability. They detect the longing for recognition beneath someone's apparent disinterest. And crucially, they perceive these things before the other person has consciously acknowledged them. This is not intuition in the loose popular sense. It is a form of perceptual precision that operates on information most people have not learned to consciously read. And herein lies the specific suffering of the mature empath who has not yet reached their threshold. They are perpetually aware of dimensions of reality that the people around them are simultaneously experiencing but not perceiving. They live in a form of double consciousness, aware of the visible surface of interactions and equally aware of the invisible structures beneath them. And when they attempt to speak from this deeper awareness, they encounter a response that is perhaps the most psychologically destabilizing experience available to a sensitive mind. They are told they are wrong about what they perceived, not that the perception was incomplete, not that the interpretation was imperfect, but that the underlying reality they sensed simply did not exist. This is the experience of what we might call perceptual invalidation. And for the empath, it carries a weight that others rarely appreciate. Because the perception in question did not arise from speculation or projection, it arose from something the empath experienced as direct contact with reality. To be told that contact was false is not merely to be disagreed with. It is to be told that the fundamental instrument through which you engage with the world is unreliable. Repeat this experience enough times, across enough relationships, across enough years, and something predictable begins to occur within the empath's psychology. They begin to question not just their specific perceptions, but their right to trust their own awareness. They begin to translate their sensitivity into a liability. They begin to expend extraordinary energy, defending not just their interpretations, but the validity of their fundamental mode of experiencing the world. And once you understand this dynamic, the exhaustion that precedes the threshold makes complete sense. The empath is not tired of people. They are tired of the labor of existing in a form of perpetual psychological self-defense, tired of the constant effort to establish the legitimacy of their own inner experience within relational spaces that were never designed to accommodate it. And once this happens, the emotional recalibration begins. This is a process that is rarely recognized for what it is, either by the empath themselves or by those around them. From the outside, it may appear as withdrawal, as increasing self-sufficiency, as a growing reluctance to engage in certain kinds of conversation. Others may describe the maturing empath as becoming guarded, or private, or harder to reach. And superficially, these observations are accurate. But they misidentify the mechanism. What is actually occurring is a fundamental reorganization of how the empath allocates their perceptual and emotional resources. Before the recalibration, the empath's sensitivity was distributed outward almost indiscriminately, available to whoever entered their relational field, responsive to whatever emotional signal was transmitted in their direction. They had, in a sense, an open system, constantly receiving, constantly processing, constantly attempting to respond to the emotional data generated by their environment. The recalibration closes certain channels, not all channels, not the capacity for empathy itself, but the specific channels through which the empath previously fed their inner world into the external domain of explanation and justification. It is as though a system that was operating on an enormous energetic deficit has finally begun to route its power differently, inward rather than outward, toward depth rather than toward legibility. The empath begins, often without fully understanding why, to invest in their own inner experience rather than in its translation for others. They begin to trust what they perceive without requiring external confirmation. They begin to recognize that a perception does not need to be received to be valid. This shift is subtle, but structurally significant, because it marks the beginning of what might be called the detachment sequence. The detachment sequence is not a closing off of the self. That is the most common misunderstanding of this process, both by those observing it and often by the empath themselves in its early stages. True detachment, in the psychological sense we are examining, is not a movement away from others. It is a movement toward oneself. It is the reclamation of a center that was previously distributed across the emotional landscapes of everyone the empath encountered. And this reclamation produces a phenomenon that initially feels disorienting, even frightening. The empath begins to notice that the urgency to explain, to justify, to be understood, has diminished. Conversations that once felt critical, to navigate carefully, now feel optional. Situations that once required elaborate internal preparation now pass through their FAV without generating the same charge. And in the place of that familiar urgency, they find something quieter, more stable, less immediately gratifying but infinitely more sustaining. They find themselves not as a concept, not as an idea about who they are, but as a living psychological presence that does not depend upon external recognition for its coherence. This is not emotional, it is structural. And once this structure begins to consolidate, the relationship between the empath and when explanation undergoes a transformation that nothing external can reverse. There is a particular moment that many mature empaths can identify, even if they struggle to articulate it precisely. A moment in a conversation, or perhaps at the end of one, in which they realized with sudden and total clarity that nothing they were about to say would land. Not because the words were inadequate, not because the timing was poor, but because the person across from them was operating within a framework that had no room for what was being offered. And instead of the familiar surge of frustration, instead of the reflexive impulse to try again from a different angle, there was something unexpected, a stillness, a quiet recognition that the conversation had already reached its natural limit, and that this limit was not a failure but a fact. This moment is the identity shift principle in its purest expression, because the empath who experiences it is not the same person who entered the conversation. Something has reorganized internally, without announcement, without drama. The part of the psyche that once equated being understood with being safe has released its grip. And what remains in its place is something far more durable, a self-concept that no longer requires the participation of others to remain intact. You must understand what this represents in the life of someone who has spent years, possibly decades, locating their psychological stability in the quality of their relational experiences, for whom being seen clearly by another person felt not like a luxury, but like oxygen. The transition out of this orientation is not simply a change in behavior. It is a change in identity. And identity shifts of this magnitude do not occur quickly. They are the product of accumulated experience, accumulated disappointment, accumulated wisdom, and finally, accumulated self-recognition. The empath does not stop explaining because they have given up on being understood. They stop explaining because they have understood something more important, that their inner world does not require external validation to be real, that their perceptions do not require consensus to be accurate, that their silence is not a concession but a form of dignity. But what most people don't realize is the quiet power reversal that occurs in the wake of this transformation. Because when the empath stops explaining, something shifts not only within them, but within the relational dynamics that surround them. The people who were accustomed to receiving those explanations, accustomed to the steady stream of emotional transparency that the empath once offered, begin to notice its absence. And this absence, paradoxically, communicates more than all the explanations ever did. There is a particular kind of authority that emerges in a person who no longer needs to convince others of their experience, who no longer seeks permission to trust what they perceive, who moves through conversations with the quiet composure of someone who has no defensive interest in the outcome. Others sense this authority without necessarily understanding it. They may experience it as confidence, or mystery, or an unsettling calm. They may attempt to provoke explanation, to draw out the familiar transparency, to re-establish the relational dynamic in which the empath was legible and therefore manageable. And when those attempts fail, when the empath simply observes without producing the expected response, a particular kind of disorientation occurs in the other person, because they have encountered a boundary that does not announce itself, a limit that carries no apology. This is the power reversal logic at its most precise. The empath, by withdrawing the labor of explanation, has removed a resource that others unconsciously depended upon, a resource that served not only the empath's need for connection, but also the other person's. Kamoke need to feel in possession of a clear and comprehensible version of who the empath was. Without that offered comprehensibility, the other person is left to sit with their own uncertainty, and that uncertainty, in relationships that were previously structured around the empath's accessibility, can be profoundly uncomfortable. And once this happens, another dimension of the transformation becomes visible, because the mature empath who has undergone this identity shift does not simply become more contained. They become more selective in a way that is qualitatively different from anything they practiced before. Previously, the empath's selectivity was often defensive, a coping mechanism deployed against the exhaustion of too much openness. They withdrew because they needed to recover. They became more private because the alternative had become unsustainable. But the selectivity that emerges on the other side of this transformation is not defensive. It is discerning. It arises not from depletion, but from clarity. The empath has learned, through a long and often painful process, to read the relational field with a precision that goes far beyond their original hyperattunement. They can now distinguish, with remarkable accuracy, between the person who is genuinely capable of encountering their inner world and the person who is seeking a simplified version of about it, between the conversation that will produce genuine contact and the one that will produce only the appearance of it. And this discernment, once activated, operates as a kind of filter, one that does not prevent connection, but refines the conditions under which connection becomes possible. Here is the truth most people miss about what happens to an empath's relationships in the aftermath of this transformation. The relationships that survive it are not necessarily the longest or the most familiar. They are not determined by history or proximity or shared circumstance. They are the relationships in which the other person is capable of something specific, of receiving the empath's silence as a form of communication, of understanding that a person who no longer explains themselves is not withholding. They are disclosing something far more significant than words can carry. They are disclosing the full weight of their inner sovereignty, and the people capable of receiving this form of disclosure are rare. They are the ones who do not require constant emotional transparency to feel secure in a relationship. They are the ones who can hold uncertainty without filling it with assumption, the ones who sense depth without demanding that it surface and perform itself for their comfort. These are the relationships that remain, and they are, without exception, different in quality from anything the empath has previously known, because they are built not on the empath's legibility, but on the empath's wholeness. Not on what the empath can offer in the form of explanation, but on who the empath has become in the end. Absence of it. This is where everything changes, finally and completely. Because the empath who reaches this stage is no longer navigating the world from the position of the perpetually explaining, perpetually translating, perpetually self-justifying consciousness that once defined them. They are navigating from a different position entirely, one characterized by a quality of inner stillness that was previously inaccessible, a stillness that is not passivity, not disengagement, not the quiet of someone who has nothing left to say. It is the stillness of someone who has discovered that they do not need the world to echo them back in order to trust the sound of their own voice. And from this position, their empathy undergoes a final and decisive transformation. It is no longer something that happens to them. It is no longer an involuntary permeability to the emotional states of others. It becomes a tool, precise, directed, conscious, available when they choose to extend it, retractable when they choose to withdraw. And this transformation, this movement from passive receiver to active perceiver, marks the completion of a journey that began with overwhelming sensitivity and ends with something that looks from the outside remarkably like composure, but is, from the inside, something far more specific. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that your inner world requires no audience to be valid, no consensus to be true, and no explanation to be real. This is not a closing. It is not a retreat. It is an arrival at the one psychological destination that actually matters, the place where you are no longer divided between who you are and who you are trying to make others understand you to be, where the labor of self-justification has finally, permanently, and irrevocably ceased. And from this place, the mature empath does not become less. They do not shrink. They do not grow cold, or distant, or inaccessible to genuine connection. They become, for the first time, fully themselves, not in the performance of that self for others, but in the quiet, sovereign, irreversible inhabitation of it. And that, perhaps, is the most precise definition of psychological maturity that exists. Not the accumulation of experience, not the mastery of emotion, but the moment you stop explaining yourself to a world that was never equipped to understand you, and realize, with complete and untroubled clarity, that you never needed them to.